Oh no, I mean I was just thinking I just downloaded State of Decay 2, which is like a zombie video game, and like the first thing that I met with is a banner that says Black Lives Matter, and I don't know anything about the company that developed the game, but it just felt very strange to be like loading up a zombie game and be hit with this protest that was, especially at its like outset, even in this past year in 2020, for a while was like feeling very subversive and very radical, and I still think it still has that potential and feeling for a lot of folks. But it is interesting how quickly, corporate America has been able to try to participate in that conversation. But, just so we don't get too distracted down that rabbit hole there, I do think it's worthwhile to talk about, so that's mass culture stuff, right? Its relation to the left, I think is important. What do I mean by that? The relation between us as individuals to politics, right? Yeah. And it's a big problem for the left, particularly the socialist left. But I also think it actually cuts across all spectrums of like non-voters, people who want to consider themselves to be socialists, but working class people, is a belief that politics is like a way that you can express your feelings versus express your power as a class, right? That has to do with class de-alignment, things like this. Not to put too many things together at once, but I want to quote from Mark Fisher, who you quote in the book many times, about this question of purism, right? Because I think because you talk about this is a consequence of neoliberalism, right? I don't think that it's a mistake that we're seeing this across the spectrum in culture. But it's particularly a problem for the left, which if you're talking about anyone feeling powerless, if you consider yourself to be a left-wing person, you probably are feeling, as powerless as you can be politically. This is the Mark Fisher quote right here. Purism shades into fatalism. Better not to be in any way tainted by the corruption of the mainstream. Better to uselessly resist than to risk getting your hands dirty, right? Which that's from his piece on Exiting the Vampire Castle, but you sort of lock into your argument against the cancel culture sense of view of the world, right?
Yeah, and I think the two are linked because the same way that with what we were just talking about, which is the way that the post George Floyd unrest got to a disturbing extent, kind of diverted and channeled that energy into a lot of symbolic nonsense in many cases, sort of getting corporations to make certain gestures, getting I don't you no longer even live there. I can probably say this is I always I've used this example 100 times, but I always vague it up and say it's a friend of mine who's a podcaster who lives in Brooklyn. And then the joke I always make is that narrows it down to 5,000 people. But David Griscom is the source of the story. I think I could say at this point, especially because now he's not even in that, in Brooklyn anymore. But but I remember you sent me those the screenshots from that local beer place in where you lived, where people were piling on the website of this like neighborhood beer garden because they hadn't issued a statement in support of the protest last summer. They also hadn't issued any other statement. They hadn't done anything.
Never. They would post a picture that said we have beer specials, right? Like that. And then everyone was getting worked up because they hadn't done anything on their Instagram account in solidarity and support of the protest, right? Which was wild to me.
Yeah, totally.
Not to go into this thing, but knowing having worked at many bars in my life, and knowing that the people who do the Instagram typically are just some guy you pay $200, give him that he never shows up again, right?
Yeah, and the question to my mind is, why are people doing stuff like that? And I think that a big part of the reason, and this connects up with what you're raising now, is that changing the way that policing works in America is an incredibly heavy political lift. I mean, that's amazingly difficult. Things are so bad that we were all amazed, whenever it was a week or two ago, when somebody who was filmed committing murder that everybody saw
Hmm.
was actually convicted. That was that was shocking, that happened. So changing the way that those systems work is incredibly difficult. Harassing like some like neighborhood beer place into mumbling the right words is incredibly easy. So of course you're going to get diverted from the really hard thing to the really easy thing. And I think that there's a version of this that happens specifically on the left, and that ties into that Fisher quote that you just gave, where actually trying to win power, to win a primary, to win a strike, any of those things are really hard. I mean, they like we just saw. I mean, my God, right? I mean, the last year, we saw the Bernie campaign, crash and burn after an incredibly promising, beginning. We saw this organizing campaign in Bessemer that people had all these hopes, invested in, failing, and that is really difficult. And once you do get your hands dirty in those attempts to change the real world, I mean, you get your heart broken. Whereas if you can kind of retreat into this posture of sort of performative radicalism, that's a lot easier psychologically. And so I think that's one reason why we've seen a kind of like, especially on like the online left, since the Bernie campaign, especially since the election, with great difficulty, I'm going to resist the temptation of naming any names, but we've seen a real retreat into into a lot of performative ultra leftism, and like, oh no, I never should have supported that, Bernie stuff anyway. That's, bourgeois politics, that because it's easy, it's comforting, it's zero risk. And I think it's the same thing when people end up tearing each other apart over the tiniest of political differences. I mean, we had, I'm not going to derail anything into the specifics of this, but I mean, a few months ago, we had people like issuing bulls of excommunication at each other over a disagreement about a parliamentary tactic.
That's what I was thinking about with that Mark Fisher section too.
And I don't want to like relitigate it too much, or more of what I'm saying is like, I just don't want to spend too much time on it. But I actually do think that's worth bringing up. That point is worth bringing up, right? Because it's a lot easier to sit here. Like let's not, like, first of all, like when it comes to the tactic, right? I'm all about it. I think that AOC should be doing a hell of a lot more. I think they all could be doing a hell of a lot more. Maybe I'm just pessimistic in my analysis of it and saying like, I don't find those folks to necessarily be representatives of like the socialist movement. I think they are outgrowths of what we've been able to do, that we have people who are fairly sympathetic, right? But I don't see them as like party members, for example.
Yeah,
right. Anyways, this is, I don't want to get into like the tactics, right?
No.
What was frustrating about that moment, right, was that like there wasn't a belief of its victory, but of its expression, right? And this goes back to what we were saying earlier, where politics can be an expression of your like frustration and anger, which we all like very much feel. The reason we were getting, or I'll just speak for myself, the reason I was getting frustrated with it was not because I think AOC and the squad or whatever beyond criticism or anything like that. It was me saying like, even if you get what you want, it's like, it's like Lacan, right? It's like, like you don't know what you want, right? Like if you get what you think that you want, you're going to be disappointed. And the point is that, to win, we have to recognize the situation that we're in, that we don't have the working class organizations that we need to be able to implement, hell, even social democratic politics in this country right now. And to get there is going to take a hell of a lot of work. It can happen, but it's going to take a hell of a lot of work. And to just think that like, what we need to be doing is expressing ourselves versus like building these movements, I think is a mistake. And that was a thing to me. It was like, is a fantasy though that comes out of like a despair, right? Out of like, we're actually like, we can't really do anything. Maybe we could create a, sense of spectacle to get some kind of satisfaction.
Right. Go ahead. You want to respond, Ben?
No, I think that's right, and I did like, and in that case, again, I mean, I think that the tactic, it itself, I mean, like I was I mean, obviously happy to, to have that argument. It's
well, yeah. Can we just clarify it a little bit? Like, there's a couple tactics, right? Like, the thing that I think pretty much everybody on the left agreed with, which is that that AOC and Squad can use sort of leverage for something. And then it got redirected into the only thing they can use it for is to force this vote, which will, and this was all done in the course of like, it's a pandemic, right, with that moral blackmail, I would call it. Meanwhile, the result of it would be going down, and then basically the material reward for that entire thing would be primary material in a couple of years. Like, I mean, it was ridiculous.
At best, but beyond that, it's mainly it's like to have psychic targets to be able to come out.
Exactly.
Right?
I love that, you're right, but I mean, they're all targets.
No, exactly. So look, I don't want to derail this to relitigate in something that I'm probably going to continue having nightmares about, in 40 years. But people want to know what I thought about the thing itself. I wrote an article in Jack at the time. You can check that out. But what concerns me in this context is not so much good tactic, bad tactic, okay tactic, as the fact that a argument over a proposed like one-day parliamentary maneuver was treated as if people were like fighting on opposite sides of like the Russian Civil War or something, that like that it was this like, oh my God, we have to like excommunicate everybody who has the wrong take on this like proposed parliamentary tactic that won't happen anyway, but like, if it did, blah, 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 right? Like that to me indicates that something is going on other than an earnest attempt to change the world. And like, and I should say, like, tons of people I respect disagreed with me about the particulars of the issue. Cornel West, for God's sake. But I think that that disagreement, I think, is an extremely minor disagreement. And that's my point. Yeah. Like, how is it that this extremely minor disagreement about parliamentary tactics was taken as this big melodramatic thing that's like, oh, now you've really shown us, like who you are, you counter-revolutionary. And I think that's like a really bad sign of the kind of psychic space that people were entering into at that point. I think there have been a lot of bad signs like that because, we had this moment it was a long moment, but basically 2015 to 2020, the two Bernie campaigns, when it kind of seemed like the door of political possibility was opening for us. Not like, I mean, in a very small way. I mean, we're ultimately talking about social democratic electoralism, and and even there is very limited. But it's something like it was incredibly excited after what like the last several decades we're like for the left, and now we're in this moment where that started to close again and or at the very least become much more complicated, right? Like it's much less clear where there's a path forward, and I think a lot of people are freaking out about it, and it's really bringing out some of the worst tendencies of the left. And I mean I will say, look, I mean I started writing this book at the end of 2019, and I was writing it in like spring of 2020, and there were moments that spring where I actually had thoughts like, oh man, this book's not going to come out until 2021. When this comes out, it's entirely possible Bernie Sanders is going to be president, because Bernie is president, that like DSA will be like have like 1 million people in it. It'll have like had another like crazy proportional growth spurt. There are going to be tons of things going on in real world activism, because of that. A book about how the left gets bogged down in counterproductive moralism and gets in its own way is just going to seem weirdly irrelevant in this moment. So what am I doing spending my time on this? And man, I did not need to worry about that.
Yeah, I'd say not.
No, I think that's on. Well, we definitely had some other things we wanted to get to, but I feel like we've covered so much with this book, which is a testament about how much people need to be spending time with this book because it brings up so many important questions for us. I wanted to read a quick line from it before we disappear because I think it's good, where Ben says, When politics becomes a moral performance, the question of whether or not you're actually advancing your stated goals recedes into the background. And we should be focusing on those goals. Those should be right on the horizon for all of us. And if everybody spends some time reading this book, maybe it'll be a little bit closer. Thanks so much, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.